For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Lico, previously known as Richard Lico. I've been in this animation industry, well, gaming industry for 26 years now, which makes me about as old as most dinosaurs. It's been a wild ride in this industry. I've gotten to see it from its early days of pure craziness, and I've got amazing stories from back then. And then, the modern industry now, sorry, that we're all quite used to at this point. I worked at Polyarc. I helped create the studio with some friends. We created the Moss franchise together. I was animation director, co-director of the Moss games. Before that, I worked at Bungie for 8-something years. I was on Halo Reach, Halo 3 ODST, and the Destiny games. I was actually in a room with Jones coming up with Destiny back in the day, and Jones and a bunch of other people. But before that was, X-Men and Star Wars and Condemned and a bunch of other games that probably most people don't remember. So let me go over a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. So I'm essentially pitching 4 ideas and 1 absolute ruthless abandonment of process and bottom-up specifics. I'm starting this out. I'm stating this out loud because as an industry, we've gravitated towards, heavy emphasis on process while departments are living in silos, with discipline considerations causing us to lose sight of what matters most, which is our players. But that's a broader topic. Today, let's apply that idea, that bigger picture perspective, to the topic of characters. So the talk is only 30 or 40 minutes long. And let's start with what makes a successful character. So my wife bought this piece of artwork for our bathroom a few months ago. And yeah, a baby kraken in an old school carriage over what looks like a page from a dictionary, right? So when you're on the toilet, it's at eye level, and it's really, really easy to just get lost in this image. And pretty quickly, I noticed something about it. That Val Kilmer from Willow was watching me poop. And yeah, it's a funny way to open this talk about characters, but I have a good point, I promise. Like, you see, we as humans, we do this kind of thing all the time, right? It's called pareidolia. It's the same reason we see Jesus in toast, right? It's our way of finding humanity everywhere we look, because humanity, especially ourselves, are often what we find most noteworthy. Like in this case, somehow my brain says that Val Kilmer is actually more interesting to me than a kraken in a baby carriage. So this lecture is actually about us as developers, about us as players. It's about what's important. It's about our souls. And by extension, it's about how we reflect that soul back at our players using characters. So let me talk a little bit about what makes a successful character. Now, we don't bond with pixels. We don't feel for polygons. So do we actually feel? Well, we feel for ourselves, seen through something else. Like a great character isn't a game asset meeting required design metrics. There's someone through whom we recognize our own emotions, our fear, our hope, our stubbornness, our wonder. The character's job is to hold that emotion long enough for the player to find themselves in it. So let's break down what makes a successful character by starting with essentially the 2 main types of characters that you see in this industry. There's your character archetype versus your character spectrum. Now, an archetype is comfortable. The moment a player recognizes one, they have an immediate sense of who this character is and how they might reflect themselves through that character. But that comfort, has a ceiling. Archetypes can rarely be more than one clear thing. They resist nuance. They cannot embody contradiction or chaos because contradiction and chaos are exactly what an archetype isn't. Like, for example, I'm crazy and I'm like, well, I ask an AI, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm using AI. I asked an AI, like, what can I look like as a superhero? And I uploaded some pictures and it came up with this. And I figured that's a good way to illustrate chaos. So archetype makes wonderful entry points, right? They're your Tinder swipe right. They're your marketing. They're your golden ratio. But I'll argue that an archetype can rarely be a successful character. Because within a character, we directly gaze at our own reflection. And our players are not archetypes. We, as players and as developers, are imperfect. We dress ourselves in elegant nuance. We don't comprehend our own depths. We embody contradiction, and some more than others are agents of chaos. My wife really believes I'm quite one of them. We are not archetypes. We're a spectrum of light and color. We're not gameplay systems, but we represent ourselves in gameplay. And then we often balk at our own depth. We focus on process, systems, finding fun, and capturing short attention spans. These efforts are necessary, but they can cause us to forget what a character really is. So let me illustrate. So Team Fortress 2 here, this is the embodiment of an archetype become a character. Like the spy, the heavy, the medic, every character has a gameplay purpose, right? Like a clear player fantasy, a one-dimensional identity. That's the archetype, clean, functional, instantly readable. But once you immerse yourself in their world some more, like the vocal quips, the individual cinematics that Valve releases outside of gameplay over the years, like the ethos that players themselves built around these characters as they hop online and talk about it in Reddit, suddenly there are layers. And looking at this lineup, I feel like I know who would vote Republican or who would vote Democrat, like who's a cat person, who's a dog person, who would shank me from behind for assuming either. But Team Fortress 2 never strays too far from that trope, right? And that's intentional because in this context, players don't need a lot of depth. They just need enough to see a simplified reflection of something relatively human, something recognizable, something cartoon-like. The archetype is really the entry point, and the character is part of what keeps them there. Now, over the years, the games that created the most memorable characters understood this balance. Some game types lean heavily on archetypes by necessity, right? Like competitive shooters and fighting games. The archetype is the design, and it works beautifully in that context. Now, narrative games, they actually have the luxury of depth, which someone mentioned right before starting this. More time with the character means more room for contradiction, nuance, and chaos. I think actually Red Dead Redemption 2 is kind of the outlier here in this whole slide because its characters are so incredibly diverse, rich, and chaotic. But, despite all of that, Arthur and John really have no perceptible gameplay differences. They're two distinct personalities anchored by the same archetype, because the gameplay itself couldn't support the distance between them. So the narrative had to carry their character because the systems didn't. And that's just an interesting thing to think about out loud about how we intentionally design our games. And not every game needs character depth, and it's a legitimate design choice. Some games intentionally offer a blank slate, typically referred to as player avatars, a heroic vessel that the player fills themselves. No fixed personality, no imposed reflection, just pure gameplay and self-expression. And this works especially well in first-person and system-heavy games where some players simply don't want to embody someone who doesn't reflect their own gender, beliefs, or identity. Destiny is the perfect example of this. The spectrum is essentially absent. 3 gameplay styles and a blank page, right? And I would know, I primarily animated Destiny's Guardians, and in my opinion, they are not successful characters, but they are wildly successful avatars. And Destiny is one of the most successful franchises in gaming history, so that's not really a contradiction. Because every game has a focus. If you're making the next SimCity, this entire lecture is absolutely useless to you, and I respect that completely. But if your game has characters, intentionally has characters, you need to be intentional about them. Because when you properly reflect who your players are back at them, it's one of the most powerful design tools available to you, and unfortunately, one of the most expensive. Because characters can absolutely devastate your schedule. They're often the single most expensive asset in your game, and when budgets tighten, the temptation to truncate them is real. But truncating a character doesn't just save time, right? Like, it can invalidate everything you've already spent because the character has a minimum bar. You fall below it, and you haven't just wasted your investment. You may have actively created a negative player experience. Like, take this toad here from the Moss games. He was scheduled for, I don't know, like a few days across each department. And the thinking was, he's just a character-shaped asset, right? Like, he opens a door, so how much time could he possibly need to do that, right? And I absolutely pushed back. I said he'd take a month for animation alone and asked every other department to please reassess their schedules. The reason he was underestimated is because his design intent was too narrow. It was enter room, trigger door open, he plays a clip, door opens, right? That's it. That was the extent of it. But that's not who this character is. So here we have, this is the release version. We have a player from TikTok petting the toad. I added all this. Quill's reacting the whole thing. And the player, if they were actually to mess with the mushrooms, he would try and stop them, like if you do it long enough. But if you make him happy, he does something that you wouldn't expect. He gets a fist bump. And you literally have to reach in and fist bump him. And players adored this. Because that toad added so much more player value to that section of the game. He went from being a simple doorknob to making the player excited to see what's behind the door he's opening. This takes the character from a progression metric to a progression reason. You know, combat, exploration, puzzle solving, these are time-tested reasons for players to stay engaged, right? We all know that. They work, we know they work, but they're not the only levers we have to pull here. A compelling character can be just as powerful a motivation to keep players playing as gameplay systems themselves. Because every player's favorite topic is themselves, like their thoughts, their feelings, their wonder. The more we reflect that back at them, the more personal their experience becomes, and the more invested they are. Great characters don't just give players something to do. They give players a reason to care. But what if the schedule doesn't support it? Like, if the schedule doesn't support a character done right, just consider cutting them entirely. I mean, it's not a failure. I mean, that's a good production decision. There are far less expensive ways to make a world feel rich and alive. So focus your resources. Just prioritize ruthlessly. Because here's the trap that I see so many developers fall into. It's that any character-shaped object is a worthwhile character. And I'm here to tell you, it is not. A lifeless character that players are annoyed by or just are a time sink to them, they don't just fail to connect. They actively diminish every other character in your game, or the world building you've got going on, or any other design aspect that's trying to pull players in. It reminds players that they're just pushing buttons. It breaks the spell. Players only care about a character who inspires them enough to wonder and reflect their own lives back at them. Anything below that bar isn't really a neutral choice. In my mind, it's a negative one. So how do we support characters? Well, animation, that's been my world for a long time, even though it's not the only thing I've done. So let's just talk about animation for a bit, because I think it'll be helpful. But what is animation? Let me just define that really quickly, because when I say animation to game developers, they usually don't even know what it is. Because here's the misunderstanding that quietly ruins most games. Animation is actually not the art of movement. Movement is mechanical. Movement is physics. Movement lacks interest until it has meaning. Like, you can have perfect movement and a completely dead character. Animation is the art of invoking life. The craft of making something that does not think or feel seem like it does. When animation is working, you don't think, oh, yeah, that was a good transition. Like, you just feel something about it. So a character who responds to gameplay inputs with movement is providing feedback. And that's honestly what animation is typically considered in this industry these days. But that's it. It's feedback. It's useful. It's necessary. Sometimes it's pretty with nice visuals, but it's not enough. It doesn't make your character, or it doesn't make you wonder what your character's thinking, what they're feeling, whether they're afraid, whether they care, you know? Feedback tells you what happened. Life makes you feel something about it. Now, let me just state this up front, because this is always the argument I get from everyone anytime I make that statement. Gameplay feel comes first. Always. I mean, take first-person shooter gunplay, right? Like my Destiny time. When a player shoots someone, animation has to answer a few questions instantly, like, where did I hit them? How much damage did I do? Are they still a threat? Are they dead? Am I safe? Can I move on? You know, you get those answers wrong, and nothing else matters. The game feels broken before it gets a chance to feel alive. And if you nail them, you have a satisfying game, which creates an opportunity, but you don't yet have a character. Now, what if the allies of that downed character reacted, not to you, but to them? The loss of someone they knew. Suddenly, you're not just processing feedback anymore. You're asking yourself questions that you didn't expect. Did that character deserve to die? Will their allies come for me now? What kind of person does that make me? You know, we haven't changed a single gameplay system with those questions. We haven't touched the gunplay and the feedback. We've only added life to the characters in that moment. And now we're asking our players to think, to feel, and to wonder. I think Shadow of War built an entire system out of that theory, the Nemesis system, and it did really well for them. Monolith was awesome. Let's take it a step further now. Let's say your first-person avatar, he or she exits the fight breathing hard, right? Not because a gameplay mechanic requires it, not because a designer expects it, just because that's what a person does after something like that, right? They may wipe their brow during a quiet moment. They may shield their eyes from the rising sun. The player didn't ask for this, and a designer didn't tie it to a gameplay metric. But subconsciously, they feel like we're reading their minds because the character does what they're feeling. And that's not gameplay feedback anymore. That's your character validating the player's feelings. Now, I run an online animation school called Animation Sherpa. And I don't do live lectures anymore because Washington State now taxes that. But when I did, I always told my students the same thing, that there can be more animation in a single static pose than an entire movement clip. Because posing is where you find life. Posing is your animation. Posing is where the answers to your questions are found. Posing is clarity. And a good pose is harder than it looks. Yes, you need to meet the gameplay requirements. Yes, the character sheet tells you who they are. And yes, you still need to research and record reference. And after all of that, your pose still needs to tell a story. A great pose shows emotion. It implies thought. And it takes the player, and it asks the player to make interpersonal assumptions about someone who doesn't even exist. That's the heart of your animation. That's the craft of animation. And I'm not talking about cinematics. I'm talking about gameplay. I'm talking about any pose for any system whatsoever. Now, if posing is the animation, tweening is the movement that supports it. You know, good tweening makes your animation feel more grounded, more resonant, more alive. But tweening struggles to create life itself. Like, it struggles to answer questions. It only serves the life you've already found in your posing. You know, some animators will dive straight into movement, and maybe even some of them will produce remarkable performances. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but when you find life in your pose first, iteration just becomes a lot easier. When you try to find it in the movement, every new creative choice means reworking everything around that change. And that cost makes animators less likely to iterate, which means that they're less open to finding the truth. So pose for life, move to support it. So when you put those poses and your amazing tweening job into motion, something really magical happens. So consider the difference between these two statements. Number one, an axe swing crafted to meet gameplay metrics on a schedule. That's my description of an animation. Or number two, a desperate effort to overcome a lifetime of doubt and anxiety in an unforgiving and oversized world where her very survival hinges on this next passionate lunge. Both of those descriptions describe a single gameplay animation clip for a combat system. But one is an asset, the other is a feeling. One makes a producer happy, the other makes the player feel something that they may never forget. Now let me show you an example. None of this here is cinematic, yet I am telling a clear story with everything Quill's doing here. She's struggling, she's skittering, she looks scared and she looks angry. She's trying to use that hammer in a way that only she can, that not any other character would possibly use it. It yanks her off the ground. It causes her to have to tumble over it to get on the other side of it. Like, all of this is gameplay. None of this is cinematic. And I've told a very compelling story with every button press you do inside of Moz. So how do I do that? Well, when I'm animating a character, I don't decide who they are. I ask the character to tell me who they are. Now, I know I probably sound like I should be committed, but this approach has worked for me for over 26 years. So I pose a character and, I listen. Yes, I research, I use reference, yes, right? But I listen to how the character feels about the pose, what they think, what they're trying to say. Because when a character knows themselves, the performance is always more authentic, more alive. This is especially powerful at the concepting stage before identity ever gets locked in. Now, let me show you a prototype character that Chris Alderson, co-founder of Polyarc, and I created during my time there. He's the art director at the studio, and we worked together for well over 20 years. So we have like a whole process down. But I made a little video showcasing one of the characters we created. By the way, this character never made it into a final game. This was just like a little side thing that we did. So this doesn't even represent the amount of work that will go into a character like Quill, for example. And hopefully this audio. Well, I miss that little guy, Koda. I had a lot of fun making him. So let me talk a little bit about where animation fits into a schedule and a team. Because there's a lot of industry dogma here that I don't think is working for us. Because animation direction is really not quite the downstream discipline that everyone thinks it is. It's a creative peer to narrative, art, design, and audio. And when it has a seat at the table from day one, characters are built with soul from the ground up. And when it doesn't, animators are handed a process or a list and told to just make clips. It's a wildly incorrect assumption that animation is just for visuals and for movement on a schedule. Undermining animation is when we rob our characters of their lives, not intentionally, but inevitably. Now, where do other departments like engineering, like I know you guys are very engineering focused, where do you guys fit in? Well, engineers and designers are often the people who decide how much room animation gets. Memory budgets, gameplay systems, blend tree complexity, procedural layers, your time. You have a tremendous impact on our success, and every prioritization, every choice, they directly affect whether a character feels alive or dead. So when you understand what animation is actually doing, which is not moving things, but invoking life, you make different calls. You protect the right things. You trade off the right things. So let's talk a little bit more about where engineering and animation may actually overlap some, which is the techniques I'm talking about. Like, how do we do this emotional resonance? So let me just reiterate one thing. Crafting individual animation clips that invoke thought, emotion, and wonder, yeah, that's the job of an animator, right? But creating the systems that make those moments possible, that's all of our jobs. Engineering, animation, design, audio, everyone, art. Because a good character is more than a feedback system for player input, right? We've established that. But autonomy is how you build it into the foundation. Autonomy means that the character has an interior life that exists independently of what the player is doing. A good character will notice things. They react to things. They have opinions about things, even when no one asked. And this applies to every character, not just NPCs. Even your player-controlled character becomes more alive when they occasionally remind you that there's someone, not just something. Autonomy is one of the systems that makes wonder possible. Let me just add to that little statement about player character. You care more about your player character than you do any character in the game because it's the one you spend all of your time with. So investing in autonomy for your player character is one of the most powerful things you can do. So many developers think, oh, well, I want my NPC to do character autonomy. Like, I'm going to throw AI, language models at my NPC. No one gives a damn about your NPC. Like, they want the quest, they want to go on, they want to find their treasure, but they're going to do it with your player character, right? Because that's where they're spending their time. Now, I want to acknowledge this. Every designer who hears me say this has a fear reaction, and it's completely understandable. Designers think in system, progression metrics, input clarity, player guidance. They're not trained to see a character the way a good animator does. It's not criticism, it's just a different form of expertise. And diversity of perspective, when approached with open minds, is one of the most powerful tools that a team has. But here's what autonomy actually looks like in practice. A character who reacts to the environment, to sound, to light, to danger nearby, to something beautiful, to their own inner voice, independent of any player input. When a character looks at something the player hasn't noticed yet, when they flinch before a threat arrives, when they turn to watch something leave, that character now has interior life. And that interior life is also what creates bonding and wonder. Like this baby character you see here in this image, I imagined that little subhead inside of its shoulder as like the baby's baby. So the big baby would like rub the head of the little baby and put its thumb in its mouth so it can suck on it. And then I had an animation where the little baby head was sucking on the big baby thumb. And she was very protective of that baby. So if the player threatened the little baby, the big baby would be very upset and smack the player for it. It was a lot of fun. And in first person, actually, you can wield the baby in first person. I don't know if you've ever wielded a baby in first person. It's really fun to block with baby, because what happens is the player will attack you, you'll block with baby, which pisses baby off, so baby punches you. So you're just delaying the damage. But shit like that is like all, you know, what is the character thinking? Who are they? How do we represent that in gameplay? So these moments don't have to disrupt gameplay, though. Like, they can be layered over existing states as well, like triggered during natural pauses or reserved for moments where an input interruption is acceptable. Like, we already as developers do this, right? Like, when a character takes heavy damage, they recoil. The player didn't press the recoil button. They got hit. Input lockouts for a fraction of a second, right? Like, nobody complains because it just feels right. So why not apply that same logic to joy or anger or a celebration when a fight is won? If your character took 2 seconds to breathe, maybe. You know, there are so many rich, largely unexplored ideas in this space, in so many moments that can shock and inspire players long after the gameplay session ends. Now, those who explore these ideas will likely be remembered, and those who follow the rules that blend in with everyone else, you're going to have to find a way to make your game compelling without characters. You know, a character who responds to their environment feels grounded, right? This is the second technique. They feel real, they feel present, they slip a little in the mud, or the wind moves their hair. Stepping from cold into warmth, maybe they'll relax a bit. You know, small things, cheap things, enormously effective things. And none of them even need to interrupt gameplay or a single input. We can do layered look-at behavior during certain states, or overlays triggered by context or emotion, weight shifts on changing slopes, not just IK fix-up, momentum and acceleration that feels meaty, additive layers of simple ambient responses to inner feelings, not just player actions. Each one signals the same thing to the player's nervous system, that this world is real, this character knows it, and I believe it. And you don't need expensive motion blah, blah, blah. You don't need expensive motion matching to get here either. Like, you just need a few memorable moments and a consistent commitment to life. Because players forgive the occasional gameplay compromise when they believe that the character is alive. Quill didn't use motion matching. She had a very basic, well, I'm not going to say basic, but she had a semi-complicated, not motion matching movement system that did some of what we're talking about here in just very cheap ways. I was the only animator on Moss 1 and Rigger, and I did some design, and I did modeling. I did every single animation clip, and I was able to do all of that while still making her feel alive. It really isn't the amount of content you have. It's the quality of the content you make. So technique number 3, the first time exception. You pull a lever, you open a door, climb a ladder, whatever. These are repeated hundreds of times throughout your game, right? And they need to be quick, clean, out of the way of the gameplay flow. But what about the very first time? I mean, maybe let the character think it through. Let them encounter it in the way maybe a real person would, with curiosity, hesitation, a little uncertainty, right? When the player learns something new, have the character learn it with them. That single extra clip does 3 things simultaneously. It validates the player subconsciously, it implies that the character is thinking, and it builds a bond that the player will feel without even being able to name it. The schedule cost is almost nothing for something like this. 1 additional clip for a small handful of actions, but the return is enormous, and it compounds. Like, use it as a reminder when a player returns after time away or revisits a mechanic they may not have touched in a while. It's character history being built in real time, and it really fools players into thinking that the character's thinking. Last one, technique number 4, mining player intent. You know, player input isn't the only thing worth responding to. Player intent is just as important. Like, when we treat our characters as partners rather than feedback systems, something changes. The character stops being a tool that the player uses and starts being someone that the player is with. Now, think about what that looks like in practice. A player is, say, stuck on a puzzle, right? That character should be stuck with them. they should be thinking while the player is thinking. And maybe after a certain amount of time, offering a hint or a suggestion or something to inspire the player. Or maybe a player is repeating a mistake over and over again, running up against a bush for some weird reason. The character can suggest a correction, not as like a tutorial prompt, but as a friend. Like Quill, when she's climbing on a wall, if you try and send her in a direction she can't go, she literally looks over her shoulder and tells you no. And it's crystal clear, oh, I can't go that way. I mean, it's just her partnering with you in that moment. So last one, like a player who stops to take to look at the environment, like they use their camera and they look around and they're looking at a beautiful tree or something, right? When they move that camera, you know what they're looking at. Let the character acknowledge what they're looking at. Target things in the environment with like specific reactions to validate that moment. Player intent is a signal, and most games unfortunately ignore it. Your character doesn't have to. So last little section, this will go quick. I just want to talk a little bit about like practicality here. Because everything I told you today is actually on display in the Moss games. Like not in theory, in 2 shipped games, under schedule pressure, with real budgets, real trade-offs, and a team that had every reason to push back. The Moss games are where I had the autonomy and opportunity to put everything I knew into practice. And I wanted to take that moment to acknowledge the extraordinary people at Polyarc who said yes when I asked for things that had no design precedent, who had the patience and grace to let me fight for ideas that were directly at odds with traditional design dogma. Moss was better because of that collaboration with engineering, design, art, and everybody else. And what came out of that was Quill. And people seem to like it. Now, I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to pick one. Number 2, gaming trend. The entire game works because of the remarkable bond that grows between Quill and the player. And this person says, now, I don't have children, but after completing this adventure, Quill may as well be my child. I've never been so determined to keep a video game character from harm. Oh my God, that means so much to me as a developer. Because I absolutely fooled them into thinking that character was real. And all of a sudden, the key takeaway from their entire gameplay experience wasn't the puzzles, wasn't the combat, wasn't any system. It was seeing themselves or their possible child. And that's a feeling that they'll never forget. Here's another one I like, number 7. It's genuinely remarkable how strongly you emphasize with Quill throughout. She just has so much character, whether it's her little celebrations after combat or your ability to give her adorable high fives. And why I like that one is so many designers will say, well, we don't want the character to act autonomously. And yet here we have a review of our game raving about how the character acts autonomously. I'm telling you, this shit works. So what can you take away from this? Well, like I said earlier, you don't need a big team or AAA budgets to do any of this. What you need is a decision made before a single keyframe is set, before a single system is architected, that your character is a reflection, that your animation is invoking life, that your players will remember how they feel long after they've forgotten what they did. Every technical decision that follows that intention becomes the right decision, because now you know what you're building it for. Your players will forget mechanics. They'll forget systems, whatever frame rate or load times of the UI or whatever progression loop. They will not forget how your game made them feel. If your game has a character at its center, and I'm not saying they all should, but if it does, and you did it right, that character is often the reason they'd feel that way. Someone your players will recognize, someone who reflected back at them, someone who made them wonder. This is what animation is for. Not just movement, not just feedback, not pretty art, but life. Build characters with soul, and your players will carry them long after the credits roll. They'll tell their friends, they'll think about them for years. They'll feel in some quiet moment like they once knew someone. And that's the most powerful thing we can make for our players. And if you're lucky, someone will get a tattoo of your character. Soul first, always.